picture of his project.
Our bodies exist in a perfect state of balance called homeostasis, and the bone tissue...
Hello, class. By the time you view this, we should be wrapping up the how-to presentations and looking forward to the research presentations. Presenting research is going to be important, not just in your university work, but also in your careers as you go out of the university. Those of you in technical and scientific careers are going to frequently be involved in some kind of study where you're asked to compare different techniques for accomplishing a task or evaluate different types of materials. Those of you who go into something like design or marketing might be asked to survey users' preferences or analyze patterns of error or problems in accomplishing a particular task or achieving a particular objective. So presenting research is a very kind of universal skill, and it's often done very poorly. Most of the time, people get too bogged down into the details. There's too much jargon, too much information about what you did, and not enough information about the big picture. And this causes your audience to tune out, to dismiss what you say, and it can cause some mistrust. And we see a lot of this in today's political climate, where there's a lot of mistrust of scientists, of research in general. So one of my goals for this class is to teach you to present research effectively. And today we're going to focus on two techniques. I'm going to give you an overall structure for reporting different kinds of research, and then we're going to talk about how to have an effective hook or introduction for the research. Because if you don't introduce what you're doing clearly, people tune out. If you lose people in the introduction, it's almost impossible to get them back and to get them paying attention. They will dismiss your entire presentation if the introduction is not strong and compelling. But let's first talk about the overall structure. Pretty much all research follows some variation of this basic pattern, which is called IMRAD. Stands for Introduction, Method, Results, and Discussion. You have probably been using IMRAD for a long time, but you maybe didn't know it had a name. If you ever want to Google something, you can Google IMRAD and find out lots more information about this. I'm going to be putting a handout on the website that's an IMRAD cheat sheet that can give you a little bit more information about what goes in each section. It's a handout that we use all the time in the Global Communications Center. Now, one thing I want to note is that even though research pretty much always follows this structure, and this is one of the most common structures to use for organizing really anything. If you are asked, for instance, to write a trip report, you might use this structure. A trip report is a report where you go to, say, a conference or go to some site, and then you're asked to report on what you know. And you might say, well, what was the purpose of it? What did I do? What did I learn? Why was this worthwhile to the company? So IMRAD's a really common, general, kind of transportable structure. The names of the section might change, but the type of information and the order in which information is presented generally stays the same. Now, there are three main variations on this IMRAD pattern. The first variation that I'm going to talk about is experimental research. This is very classic research where a researcher or scientist goes into a lab and collects some kind of data. Some common questions. We might go into a particular setting and collect observations, or we might systematically collect data on 2 different drugs, 2 different types of material, and examine how they compare and contrast in different conditions. Or we might systematically try to examine and determine the relationship between 2 or more different things. Adding a particular chemical to a solution. What happens? How do they react? So this is the most basic, most common form of research. A variation on this is the problem solution. This is very common in applied fields like engineering, computer science, where there's some sort of existing technique, strategy, way of handling a problem that can be improved. And so problem solution projects really look at how does this new algorithm improve the amount of time it takes to run something? Or how can we fix or improve existing practices? What can we do to make the situation better? The last type, theory building, is the most flexible. It's probably most common in humanities disciplines, though we see it across a wide range of disciplines. Theory building projects ask how can we bring together multiple things under a single explanation. It's similar in some ways to experimental research in that we're trying to understand basic relationships. But unlike experimental research, theory building doesn't systematically collect data. Instead, it might look at other research or try to bring together research from really different fields into a particular explanation. And so it's very focused on understanding relationships, coming up with frameworks, theories that advance our understanding. Now, each of these types of research has a different organization, and I'm going to be asking you all what the project you've picked for the research presentation, which type of research it is. Now, experimental research, which is the most basic, fundamental, tends to pretty strictly follow the IMRAD format. The problem solution variation has a little bit different structure. We have an introduction. Instead of methods, we would have the details of your solution. So if you created a new algorithm, you would explain all the techniques that went into that. And then there's some sort of evaluation of that solution and that tends to have some methods and results. So you might say, how did I test the solution? What did I find? And typically this section would include something like, and the new solution performed 20% better than the baseline. And then it ends with the implications. Theory building has the most loose structure. We have the introduction where you present the existing theory. Typically, there's some kind of analysis of lots of different cases to kind of push on the theory to see how these cases challenge some of our existing notions, existing frameworks. And then there's a development of a new theory and ending with some kind of implications. Each of these types of research has a different emphasis. So when you're presenting experimental research, you're going to focus on the results. That will be the main sort of takeaway, what's most newsworthy, what's most new about this research. For problem solution, it's the solution that is most important. How did you solve it? By the time we get to the evaluation, people typically don't present their research unless their evaluation is in some way positive. So that tends to be a little more anticlimactic. So the solution is the most important part in a problem solution paper. And in a theory building, the most important part, the main emphasis, of course, is on the new theory that was developed. Now, even though each of these types of research have a different emphasis, a different focus, in all of them, the introduction is the most difficult and the most important part to communicate. So for class on Wednesday, I'm going to ask you guys to really figure out your introductions. Fortunately, there are well-established structures that can help you introduce research. And I'd like you right now to go to Blackboard and download the handout that says Novelty Moves. The Novelty Moves are 4 moves that we use to show why research is important, why we should care about it, why the audience should pay attention. The first move, and you'll see on the handout, is to explain the significance. Begin by talking about why we should care, what's at stake. So if your research has impact or implications for the environment, or for human health, or for human satisfaction, begin with that. Explain what's at stake. What are the consequences for the general public or for a particular segment of the public? But really begin with a short statement, and it can be just one sentence, on why we should care. Next, you want to describe the status quo. Status quo is either what researchers currently know about this particular topic, this particular research area, or it's the current practice, what's currently done, what's the most common way to address a particular problem. Once you've described the status quo, what the state of knowledge or the state of practice is currently, you need to identify a gap or some sort of flaw or problem or something that is missing or unknown. Because if there is no problem, if there are no issues, then we don't need your research. And this is a key concept from this class. Before you get into details and solutions, explain what problem you're solving. Remember, in the how-to presentations, you first need to explain the problem, then you present your how-to. Research works the same way. Just about everything is going to use this problem solution format. So by describing what the issues are, what you're trying to solve, then that prepares the way for us to understand your solution. And so the last step is to explain how you are solving the problem or how you're filling this gap. Now we're going to look at two examples in writing and then two examples of oral presentations that do that. Now these two examples in writing are on page 2 of that Novelty Moves handout. So let me just go through this really briefly. This first study is an experimental study, and it very clearly and briefly goes through all 4 of these introductory moves. So the first sentence, we have peptic ulcer disease is a chronic disease characterized by frequent recurrence. So that's a good statement of the significance. It's chronic, it recurs. These are bad things. Obviously, we want to solve them. The next sentence, recent studies have suggested that eradicating a particular type of bacteria decreases the rate of recurrence. And then it cites 6 studies. So this is the status quo. This is what researchers currently know about this disease, that getting rid of this bacteria reduces recurrence. Then, however is probably the most common way to signal a gap. Now be careful, because however is a very common word. So people can use the word however and it's not signaling a gap. In this case it is. However, interpretation of these results has been complicated because several studies did not use control groups. Moreover, studies have not been done in patients with gastric ulcer. So we know that there are no control groups that were used, and we have not studied it in this particular group. Now, based on the way that they've described this problem, we should be able to predict that last sentence. We should be able to predict what gap they're filling. And I think it's pretty clear that they are going to use control groups and study patients with gastric ulcer. And if we look at the next sentence, it of course is we report the results of a randomized controlled trial in which we evaluated the effect of therapy on ulcer recurrence in patients with gastric ulcer. So this is an example of an experimental study, and what I really want you to take away from this is that the description of the problem helps your audience predict your project. Because when we're doing research, we're typically only solving one small, tiny part of a bigger problem. So describing the specific problem that your research is addressing or trying to solve really helps the audience understand why you're doing this and not some other project that maybe they have in mind. Now let's look at another example. This one is a problem solution type project. Let me talk you through it. So first, although plastic has revolutionized modern life, the environmental impact of traditional plastics is staggering. So it's a really good statement of the significance. That the impact is staggering. We can clearly see the environmental impacts. Next, we talk about bioplastics as an alternative, and one particularly promising bioplastic is PLA. PLA is currently the cutting edge solution. So it's a good solution that has been developed. So this is a status quo. We have bioplastics and one particular kind. Then we move into, however, the commercial viability of PLA is limited because it can only be compostable in industrial facilities and can't be mixed with other recyclable materials. So here we have a cutting edge material, but it has these problems. So before I ever get to the next sentence, you should be able to predict what this project is going to do. Next sentence, to make PLA more commercially viable, and see how this repeats the word. Okay, so the commercial viability of PLA is limited. To make it more commercially viable, we propose a device that's going to compost PLA in a home composting environment. And then the last sentence is kind of like a call to action, explaining why this would benefit society. So these are some examples in writing. You want to think about having a very similar structure for your introduction to an oral presentation. Now, what I'm going to do is show you some clips from 3-minute thesis competitions. The 3-minute thesis competition is a worldwide competition where PhD students are challenged to present the research in 3 minutes or less. We're going to look at a couple examples of these, of winners of this competition, because they do a really good job explaining some complicated topics in ways that are really easy to understand. The first example that I'm going to ask you to look at has been annotated and commented on. I want you to reproduce some of this in your own words. Moreover, since this is a problem solution type of project, I'd like you to note where Arun Shrivats talks about the details of his solution and where he evaluates that solution. The second one that I'm going to show you will ask you to do on your own, and it is more of an experimental type of project. Go ahead and click on the next video and watch the annotations and fill out the worksheet.